The constable arrived within the hour, a solid man named Thornton, who had served Little Ashford for 20 years without incident. Behind him came Inspector Graves, a methodical officer from the county town whose grey suit matched his expression precisely. Both men surveyed the morning room with the practiced detachment of those accustomed to death, though the murder weapon's proximity to such comfortable furnishings seemed to strike them as particularly jarring. "Nobody leaves the property," Inspector Graves announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'll need statements from everyone present." The guests were shepherded into the drawing room, where they stood or sat in clusters determined by social proximity rather than comfort. The afternoon sunlight, so pleasant moments before, now seemed accusatory, illuminating every anxious glance and nervous fidget. Miss Marple settled herself in a wing-back chair near the window, her knitting needles once more clicking their gentle rhythm, a small, rhythmic sound that seemed to calm the room's agitation. Dr. Ashford had confirmed what appeared obvious. Lady Thornfield had been struck multiple times with the fireplace poker. Death, he suggested, would have come swiftly, probably within minutes of the initial blow. The weapon bore no useful fingerprints, having been wiped clean with deliberation that suggested this was no crime of passion but rather one of calculation. "When did anyone last see Lady Thornfield alive?" Inspector Graves asked, his notebook open, his pen poised with bureaucratic readiness. The answers came slowly, each guest searching their memory with varying degrees of apparent sincerity. Most agreed she had been present through the tea service, perhaps until 3 o'clock. Geoffrey Marsh recalled seeing her speaking with Mrs. Wickham near the rose garden at approximately 2:45. No one had noticed precisely when she had gone inside, which was itself remarkable given the number of eyes present. In a village of this size, such inattention seemed almost deliberate. "And where was each of you between 3 o'clock and 3:30? Graves continued. The answers were disappointingly vague. Marcus Thornfield had been walking the grounds, he claimed, needing air and solitude. Diana Ashford had been resting in one of the garden chairs, she said, though no one could corroborate this. Reverend Blackwell had been in conversation with Mrs. Patterson near the rose arbor. Geoffrey Marsh had been in the potting shed, preparing additional flowers for the table arrangements. Constance Wickham's answer came with less hesitation than the others. She had been inside the house, she said, having requested the use of Lady Thornfield's lavatory. She had ascended the stairs to the first floor, used the facilities, and returned to the garden. The timeline, she insisted, was perhaps 10 minutes at most. "Did you see Lady Thornfield when you were inside?" Graves asked. "No," Mrs. Wickham replied, "though I confess I did not search for her." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment at this response, then resumed their clicking with renewed vigor. She had noticed something others had overlooked. Mrs. Wickham's hands bore marks of dampness, as though she had washed them recently. This might mean nothing. The lavatory excuse certainly accounted for that. Yet Miss Marple had lived long enough to understand that people rarely explained themselves unless asked, and they rarely explained themselves at length unless they had something they wished to obscure. The questioning continued for another hour, with Inspector Graves methodically recording each statement. The motive, when it eventually surfaced, would likely prove more complex than it initially appeared. Yet, already Miss Marple could perceive certain patterns emerging. Constance Wickham had been Lady Thornfield's neighbour for more than 3 decades. Their relationship, according to the village gossip, Miss Marple had absorbed through careful listening at the post office and in the vicar's wife's parlour, had soured considerably in recent years. A property dispute, something regarding the boundary line and Mrs. Wickham's desire to expand her garden. Such small grievances often masked deeper resentments. Then there was the matter of Marcus Thornfield, the grandson who had inherited considerable expectations and very little actual income. His grandmother had been elderly, healthy for her age, but certainly not immortal. How many young men might dream of the freedom and security that inheritance could provide? And Diana Ashford, who looked at Marcus Thornfield with an expression that suggested neither indifference nor innocent admiration. There was calculation in those dark eyes, the assessment of a woman considering her options and finding them limited. As the evening descended, the guests were finally permitted to return to their homes. though Inspector Graves made clear that he would require further interviews. The body would be removed for examination, and the morning room would remain cordoned off as the scene of the crime. Little Ashford, having enjoyed 3 consecutive summers of peaceful routine, now found itself transformed into something far more sinister. Miss Marple was the last to leave. She gathered her knitting with deliberate slowness, tucked her small handbag beneath her arm, and paused at the doorway to survey the drawing room once more. Each face she observed seemed to wear a carefully constructed mask, yet beneath the surface she could perceive the workings of fear, guilt, and desperation in their various combinations. She had seen much of human nature, a long life, and she recognized these symptoms well. Somewhere in this room, she thought, sat a murderer. And before the week was finished, that person would reveal themselves through some small gesture, some unguarded moment, some perfectly human inconsistency that their conscious mind had failed to account for. The morning after Lady Thornfield's death dawned grey and uncertain, as if the weather itself had absorbed the village's unease. Miss Marple took her customary breakfast in her cottage on the High Street, a modest establishment filled with the comfortable clutter of a long life, books on the shelves, photographs of long-departed friends, and plants that had somehow survived her occasional inattention. She read the morning newspaper with particular interest, noting how the London papers had already seized upon the story. "Village murder baffles police," one headline proclaimed, as if murder was somehow more shocking when it occurred, in places presumed safe. Inspector Graves had established a temporary office in the vicar's study, commandeering the room with the bureaucratic efficiency of someone accustomed to asserting authority over others' spaces. By mid-morning, he had begun his formal interviews, starting with Marcus Thornfield. Miss Marple learned these details not through eavesdropping, though she had positioned herself conveniently in the vicarage's front garden, ostensibly visiting the vicar's wife, but rather through the careful gossip that circulated through the village like a living organism. From what she could gather, Marcus Thornfield's statement had been consistent but notably sparse. He had walked the grounds, he maintained. He had needed solitude. He had seen no one and heard nothing unusual until the screaming had begun. Inspector Graves, according to Mrs. Patterson, who had overheard fragments of conversation, seemed unconvinced by the vague Ines, but had moved on to other suspects without pressing further. This interested Miss Marple considerably. The inspector was a competent man, she suspected, but he was also a man operating under the assumption that murder in a village must follow certain patterns. He expected resentment, financial motive, or passionate dispute. He was looking for the kind of crime that made logical sense, one that fit neatly into established categories. What he might miss, Miss Marple reflected, was the more subtle variety of human motivation, the kind that accumulated over years like dust in corners, building until some minor incident provided the catalyst for violence. She decided to call upon Constance Wickham under the pretense of offering condolences. The woman lived in a cottage that mirrored her own in size but differed considerably in character. Where Miss Marple's home was lived in and warm, Mrs. Wickham's maintained an almost sterile perfection. Every cushion was precisely placed, every book arranged by height rather than subject. Mrs. Wickham herself, answering the door in a black dress she had apparently procured in haste, appeared diminished somehow, as though the act of performing grief had exhausted her. "How kind of you to call," Mrs. Wickham said, gesturing Miss Marple inside, "though I confess I find myself scarcely able to comprehend what has occurred." "These things are always shocking," Miss Marple replied gently, settling herself in an uncomfortable chair that seemed designed more for appearance than comfort, though perhaps less shocking to those who have observed human nature for many years. People are often capable of terrible things when they feel sufficiently desperate. Mrs. Wickham's hands tightened momentarily around her teacup. "Do you truly believe that desperation excuses violence?" "I did not suggest it excuses anything," Miss Marple said mildly. "Merely that it explains it. Understanding motivation does not require moral approval of the act." The conversation drifted into safer territory, the weather, the garden party, mutual acquaintances, yet Miss Marple's attention remained fixed on subtle indicators. Mrs. Wickham's jaw clenched when Marcus Thornfield was mentioned. Her fingers trembled slightly when she spoke of the property dispute with Lady Thornfield, a matter resolved, she insisted, several months prior. Most intriguingly, she seemed almost relieved when the subject turned to other topics, as though she had been tested and passed some invisible examination. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Geoffrey Marsh near the post office. The young man appeared diminished by events. His usual neat appearance, somewhat disheveled dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. She engaged him in pleasant conversation about the garden party, noting how his responses came slowly, as though his mind remained elsewhere. "You must have seen a great deal from the potting shed," she observed. "The gardeners always have such excellent vantage points for observing the household." "I was inside, Miss Marple," he replied quietly. "I didn't see anything." But his eyes, when he said this, flickered toward the direction of Diana Ashford's family home. This, too, Miss Marple noted with the precision of one cataloguing evidence. The human heart was often a careless thing, revealing secrets through the smallest gestures, the briefest glances. That evening, she received an unexpected visitor. Inspector Graves himself appeared at her cottage door, his grey suit now rumpled, his expression suggesting fatigue. He accepted her offer of tea with obvious gratitude. "I wonder," he said, after the initial pleasantries, "whether you observed anything unusual during the garden party. You seem to be a woman who notices things others might miss." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I have found, Inspector, that in a village such as ours, there are always things being missed. The question is whether one is looking at the right things." "And were you," he pressed, "looking at the right things?" She smiled faintly. "I believe I was observing the guests, yes, though I confess the significance of what I observed may not become clear until other pieces of this particular puzzle have been examined more thoroughly." The inspector leaned forward, his tired eyes sharpening with interest. "Will you tell me what you observed?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said gently. "But I suspect that before many more days have passed, something will occur that will illuminate matters considerably." Inspector Graves departed Miss Marple's cottage appearing neither satisfied nor dismissed, which suggested to her that he was a man still formulating his theories, rather than committed irrevocably to any single conclusion. She watched his car disappear down the high street, and returned to her knitting with the steady focus of someone whose mind continued working on problems, even as her hands occupied themselves with simpler tasks. The second day of the investigation brought unexpected developments. The post-mortem examination, conducted by the county pathologist, revealed that Lady Thornfield had been struck not once but 5 times with the fireplace poker. This detail, conveyed to Miss Marple through the efficient village grapevine, suggested a crime of considerable violence rather than a single calculated blow. Crimes of passion, Miss Marple reflected, often contained this element of excess, the murderer continuing long after their victim was deceased, driven by emotion rather than pragmatism. It was this fact that caused her to reconsider certain assumptions. A crime of passion implied someone over, helmed by feeling at the moment of violence, yet Constance Wickham's calm demeanour and the careful wiping of the weapon suggested something more deliberate. And Marcus Thornfield, while certainly benefiting from his grandmother's death, seemed too controlled, too observant of social convention to become so uncontrolled in violence. The third day brought a visitor to Miss Marple's cottage before 10 in the morning. Diana Ashford, still dressed in the dark colours of respect for the dead, sat across from her with an agitation that seemed barely contained beneath her composed exterior. She had brought flowers, a transparent excuse that fooled neither woman. "I wonder," Diana began without preamble, "what you told Inspector Graves about the garden party." Miss Marple regarded her visitor with undisturbed interest. "I told him very little, Miss Ashford, mostly that I had observed the guests and their interactions." "Nothing of great consequence, but you observed a great deal," Diana pressed. "That's what people say about you, that you notice things, small things that others miss." "One notices what one pays attention to," Miss Marple replied carefully. "And I have found that paying attention to human behavior often reveals truths that people prefer to keep hidden." Diana rose abruptly and walked to the window, her arms wrapped around herself as though the summer afternoon had turned inexplicably cold. Lady Thornfield was not a good woman, you know. She was controlling, demanding, utterly devoted to maintaining appearances while her family suffered beneath her thumb. Many people are like that, Miss Marple said gently. Age and power often combine to create such behavior. It does not necessarily excuse whatever you fear I might have observed. I wasn't there, Diana said, turning sharply. Between 3 and 3:30 I wasn't near the morning room. I was in the GA den, exactly as I told the inspector. I did not suggest otherwise, Miss Marple replied. After Diana's departure, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence for nearly an hour. The young woman's agitation had been genuine, but its cause remained ambiguous. Was Diana afraid of being implicated in a crime she had committed? Or was she afraid that someone else, someone she cared about, might be implicated instead? That evening brought news that shifted the investigation's trajectory entirely. Geoffrey Marsh had been found near the village stream, his wrists slashed with a knife from the Thornfield kitchen. He survived. Dr. Ashford's quick intervention had ensured his life was saved, but he was now hospitalized and refusing to speak. The act suggested either profound guilt or profound fear, and Inspector Graves seemed torn between the two interpretations. Miss Marple received this news with the same composed expression she maintained through all of life's upheavals, yet her mind raced with new possibilities. Geoffrey Marsh's attempted suicide seemed to point toward guilt, yet something about it troubled her deeply. A murderer, in her experience, typically attempted to deflect suspicion rather than invite it through such a dramatic gesture. Unless, of course, this act of self-harm was itself designed to manipulate suspicion. She visited Geoffrey Marsh in the hospital the following afternoon, bringing flowers from her garden and the gentle manner of someone accustomed to the company of the suffering. The young man lay in his hospital bed with bandaged wrists, his expression distant and empty. He barely acknowledged her presence. "I knew your mother," Miss Marple said quietly, settling herself in the chair beside his bed. "Before she passed, some 10 years ago now. She was a good woman, devoted to you entirely. I suspect she would be deeply troubled by what has occurred." "Jeff." Ray's eyes flickered toward her, then away. "The police believe you killed Lady Thornfield," Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone. "The suicide attempt certainly encourages such thinking. Yet I wonder whether that is truly what happened, or whether you are protecting someone." The young man's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Protecting someone through self-sacrifice is a noble impulse," Miss Marple continued, "but it is also fundamentally dishonest. It removes from the true guilty party the consequence of their actions, and it places you in a position of suffering for sins you did not commit. That is not love, Mr. Marsh. That is merely the mutual destruction of 2 lives instead of 1. She rose to leave, placing a hand briefly on his shoulder. As she reached the doorway, she paused and spoke without turning. "The truth, whatever it is, will emerge. It always does. The only question is whether you will face it with integrity, or whether you will permit your silence to compound the tragedy." Geoffrey Marsh's silence persisted through the remainder of the week, though the hospital staff reported subtle changes in his demeanor. He ate with marginally greater appetite. He occasionally looked toward the window as though watching for someone. Most significantly, he had ceased the vacant staring that had characterized his first days of recovery, and seemed instead to be engaged in some internal struggle of considerable intensity. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, found himself increasingly frustrated by the investigation's lack of clear resolution. The physical evidence remained minimal. The fireplace poker bore no useful markings beyond the blood of the victim. Lady Thornfield's will, when examined, revealed that Marcus Thornfield inherited the bulk of her considerable estate, though modest bequests went to various local charities and to Geoffrey Marsh's mother's mem. The financial motive, while present, seemed insufficient to explain the violence of the crime. It was on the 5th day following the murder that Reverend Blackwell requested a private meeting with Miss Marple. She received him in her sitting room on a grey afternoon, noting how his usual composure seemed fractured. The vicar was a man of faith, but also of profound human understanding, and Miss Marple suspected that someone had sought his counsel regarding matters that weighed heavily upon their conscience. "I find myself in a difficult position," Reverend Blackwell began. his fingers fidgeting with the brim of his hat. "A person has confessed to me, in the strictest confidence of the confessional, you understand, certain matters that seem relevant to Inspector Graves' investigation." "The seal of the confessional is sacred," Miss Marple replied. "I would not ask you to violate it." "No," the vicar agreed. "Yet I wondered whether you might guide me toward understanding a situation without requiring me to break that seal. You have a reputation in this village, Miss Marple, for seeing clearly through deception and confusion." Miss Marple set down her knitting and gave the vicar her complete attention. "Tell me what you can, Reverend. I will attempt to assist you in working through the ethical dimensions of your predicament." What emerged over the next hour was a complex portrait of interconnected secrets and painful truths. Someone, the vicar could not say whom without violating his sacred trust, had harbored deep resentment toward Lady Thornfield. This resentment stemmed not from recent grievance, but from events that had occurred years prior, events involving the protection of reputation and the sacrifice of an innocent person's well-being. This person, Reverend Blackwell explained carefully, believed themselves to be acting in service of protecting someone they love. Yet their actions resulted in an innocent person bearing the consequences of another's transgression. When they were confronted with a situation that might expose this long-buried truth, they acted impulsively and with terrible violence. "But they did not kill Lady Thornfield," Miss Marple said. "It was not a question." The vicar's expression confirmed her assumption. "No, they did not. Yet they fear they will be blamed for the crime, or worse, that their confession might lead to the exposure of the secret they have worked so hard to protect." After the vicar departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden as the light faded from the sky. She possessed now a fuller picture of the situation, though certain elements remained obscure. Someone harbored guilt regarding events in the past. Someone else had killed Lady Thornfield, possibly because that victim threatened to expose those old secrets. And Geoffrey Marsh, she suspected, had attempted suicide not from guilt over murder, but from guilt over complicity in silence. The following morning brought the breakthrough that Miss Marple had anticipated. A letter arrived at the police station, delivered by hand and addressed to Inspector Graves. The letter, Miss Marple learned through careful inquiry, contained a confession of sorts, though not to the murder of Lady Thornfield. Rather, it confessed to events that had occurred 15 years prior, events involving the concealment of a young woman's pregnancy and the subsequent removal of the child to an institution for unwed mothers. That young woman had been Eleanor Ashford, the doctor's wife. The child, born in secret and given up for adoption, had been Geoffrey Marsh's younger sibling. His mother had borne the infant, but the father's identity had remained hidden. Lady Thornfield, as executor of certain family affairs, had been the architect of this arrangement, ensuring that the SCA. Andal was buried, and that the young man grew up ignorant of his true family connections. Inspector Graves, upon learning this information, descended upon the Ashford household with renewed purpose. What he discovered there shocked even the seasoned inspector. Dr. Ashford, when confronted with the evidence of his long-hidden affair with a woman now deceased, confessed with remarkable swiftness to killing Lady Thornfield. She had, he explained, threatened to expose not merely the affair, but also the existence of a child that the doctor had fathered with another woman, a revelation that would have destroyed his marriage and his reputation. Yet even as the doctor made this confession, Miss Marple found herself troubled. Something about the narrative did not align with her observations. The violence of the crime suggested someone consumed by emotion, rather than someone calmly calculating self-preservation. And Dr. Ashford, while certainly capable of deception, did not possess the temperament she associated with such uncontrolled violence. She requested a private interview with Inspector Graves, a conversation conducted in the vicar's study while the doctor waited under constable supervision in another room. "Inspector," Miss Marple said carefully, "I wonder whether you have considered that a confession made under emotional duress might not necessarily reflect the truth of the matter. People confess to crimes they did not commit for remarkably complex reasons." The inspector regarded her with a mixture of frustration and respect. "You believe Dr. Ashford is innocent?" I believe, Miss Marple replied, that the person who struck Lady Thornfield with such terrible violence was someone consumed by rage rather than someone acting to protect reputation. And I suspect that person is willing to allow someone else to bear the blame. Inspector Graves released Dr. Ashford pending further investigation, a decision that generated considerable tension within the village. The doctor returned to his home and his worried wife, while the police refocused their efforts on examining the physical evidence with renewed scrutiny. Miss Marple, in the meantime, occupied herself with seemingly mundane activities, her knitting, her garden, her correspondence, while her mind worked through the intricate puzzle with the methodical precision of someone solving a particularly complex mathematical equation. She had observed one crucial detail during the garden party that had initially seemed insignificant, but now took on considerable meaning. When the screaming had begun and guests had rushed toward the house, one person had hesitated. One person had exhibited the briefest moment of surprise, followed by something that looked remarkably like resignation. That person was not Dr. Ashford. It was not Geoffrey Marsh. And it was not, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, Marcus Thornfield. It was Diana Ashford. The realization troubled Miss Marple considerably because it suggested a scenario far more complex and tragic than a simple crime of passion. She decided to visit Diana at her home, a conversation that required considerable delicacy given the sensitive nature of her suspicions. Diana received her with visible surprise, her dark eyes wary as she ushered Miss Marple into the sitting room. The young woman seemed diminished since their last meeting, her elegant composure replaced by something more fragile and uncertain. "I have been thinking about what you said," Diana began without preamble, "about protecting someone through self-sacrifice being dishonest. I have not been able to stop thinking about it, have you?" Miss Marple settled herself in a chair and folded her hands in her lap. "I wonder what prompted such thoughts. My father has made a confession," Diana said, quietly. "Yet I know with absolute certainty that he did not kill Lady Thornfield. He is attempting to protect someone. He is attempting to sacrifice himself for someone he loves." "And do you know who that person is?" Miss Marple asked gently. Diana's eyes filled with tears, though she maintained her composure through evident effort. "I suspect I do, though I pray I am wrong. The truth," Miss Marple said, "is rarely less painful than our worst suspicions, yet it is the only foundation upon which we can build honest lives. My mother loved my father," Diana continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Despite his infidelities, despite his lies, she loved him. She built her life around that love, around the belief that she could maintain our family's reputation and dignity through sheer force of will. When Lady Thornfield threatened to expose the existence of that child, my father's child, from his affair, my mother saw it as the final destruction of everything she had worked to preserve." Miss Marple remained silent, allowing Diana to continue at her own pace. "I was in the house," Diana said, her hands trembling. "I had gone inside to use the lavatory, yes, but I also went into the morning room. I saw my mother there, speaking with Lady Thornfield. I heard them discussing the child, heard Lady Thornfield insisting that the truth must be revealed, that concealment was a form of cruelty. My mother became increasingly agitated. I left before anything happened, but I heard the raised voices continuing. 'And you suspect your mother struck Lady Thornfield?' Miss Marple asked quietly. "I know she did," Diana said, her voice breaking. "Because afterward, when I returned to the morning room moments later seeking to intervene, Lady Thornfield lay upon the floor. My mother stood above her, the poker in her hands, her expression one of profound shock, as though she cool. Did not comprehend what she had done. She kept striking, as though repetition might somehow undo the terrible reality of her actions. The confession hung in the air between them, weighty and irrevocable. "Your mother has been unwell?" Miss Marple asked. "She has been increasingly unstable," Diana admitted. "Ever since my father's infidelities became impossible to ignore, ever since the whispers began in the village about his illegitimate child. She has taken medication, seen doctors, attempted to maintain control through sheer determination. But something in her finally broke." "And your father's confession?" Miss Marple pressed. He discovered the truth somehow. I do not know precisely how, and he decided that he would bear the burden rather than permit my mother to be punished for what she had done in a moment of desperation and despair. He loves her, Miss Marple, despite everything. He loves her enough to sacrifice his own freedom. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and placed a hand gently upon Diana's shoulder. You must tell Inspector Graves what you have told me, not to protect your father, but to ensure that your mother receives the help she requires. A confession made under duress, a sacrifice made in misguided love, these things serve no one. Justice requires truth, and your mother's circumstances, her mental state, her provocation, the overwhelming emotional stress she has endured, are relevant to how that justice is administered. If I speak, Diana whispered, I destroy my family. Your family, Miss Marple replied, is already destroyed. What remains to be determined is whether you will permit its members to face that destruction with honesty and the possibility of healing, or whether you will allow them to perpetuate the deceptions that created the tragedy in the first place. Diana Ashford sat in the police station the following morning. Her composed exterior finally fractured beneath the weight of truth. Inspector Graves listened to her account with the gravity of a man hearing a confession that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his investigation. The pieces, which had seemed scattered and contradictory, suddenly aligned with devastating clarity. Eleanor Ashford was taken into custody that afternoon. She offered no resistance, no denial, no attempt at self-preservation. Instead, she seemed almost relieved by the revelation, as though years of maintaining a facade of normalcy had exhausted her completely. The woman who emerged from her home was not the composed society wife of public observation, but someone diminished and fragile, her carefully constructed identity stripped away to reveal the desperation beneath. The psychiatric evaluation, conducted by a specialist brought from the county town, confirmed what Miss Marple had intuited. Eleanor Ashford was a woman whose mental state had deteriorated significantly over the preceding years. The stress of maintaining her husband's infidelities in secret, of pretending normalcy while her world crumbled, had accumulated into a psychological breaking point. Lady Thornfield's threat to expose the truth had, in Eleanor's distressed mind, represented the final destruction of everything she had labored to preserve: the violence of the crime, the repeated striking, the loss of control, reflected not the actions of a calculating murderer, but of a woman whose fragile hold on rationality had shattered entirely. Yet this understanding, while it explained the crime, could not undo it. Dr. Ashford's confession was formally withdrawn. He was questioned extensively regarding his knowledge of his wife's deteriorating mental state, his response to her instability, and whether he had sought professional help for her condition. His answers were evasive and pained, the responses of a man confronting the consequences of his own deceptions. Had he sought help for Eleanor? Had he been honest about the extent of her suffering rather than insisting she maintain appearances? The tragedy might have been prevented. Geoffrey Marsh was released from the hospital and from police suspicion, though the scars on his wrists remained visible reminders of his crisis. Miss Marple visited him once more, finding him seated in his family's modest cottage, seemingly lost in contemplation of events beyond his control. "You knew," she said without preamble, settling herself in the chair across from him. "You knew that Eleanor Ashford had killed Lady Thornfield." "I suspected," Geoffrey admitted quietly. "I saw Diana emerge from the house with a particular expression on her face, and when I learned that my mother's child, my sibling, had been the topic of conversation between Lady Thornfield and Mrs. Ashford, I understood the motive. Eleanor Ashford was my mother's friend, you understand. My mother had confided in her years ago about the pregnancy, about the forced separation from her child. Lady Thornfield's threat to expose this secret would have been devastating to Eleanor as well, not merely to her husband. "Yet you attempted to take your own life," Miss Marple observed. "I did not know whether to speak or remain silent," Geoffrey said, his voice hollow. "I knew that if I remained silent, an innocent man might be blamed for a crime he did not commit. Yet if I spoke, I would expose the secrets that my mother had died protecting. I could not resolve the conflict between those two loyalties. My mind broke beneath the weight of it." Miss Marple studied the young man with compassion tempered by the clear-eyed understanding of someone who had seen much human suffering. "Have you considered that your mother, whatever her reasons, made choices that shaped the events that followed, that those choices created consequences that extended far beyond her own life?" Geoffrey did not respond, but his silence was answer enough. In the weeks that followed, little Ashford gradually returned to something resembling normalcy, though the village's character had been fundamentally altered by the tragedy. Mrs. Ashford remained in custody awaiting trial, her mental state improving marginally under professional psychiatric care. Dr. Ashford continued his medical practice, though his patients diminished considerably as people struggled to reconcile the man they had trusted with the infidelities and deceptions that had emerged. Diana Ashford withdrew from village society, spending increasing amounts of time away from the cottage that had become suffused with shame and sorrow. Marcus Thornfield inherited his grandmother's estate as circumstances had always seemed to dictate, yet his possession of the inheritance felt hollow and tainted by the violence that had accompanied his inheritance. He made inquiries regarding the legitimate heir, the child his grandmother's generation had forced into adoption, and privately provided funds to ensure the young man's education and future security, though he never made direct contact. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a warm afternoon in July, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm. Reverend Blackwell had called upon her to discuss Eleanor Ashford's spiritual state, and they had spent an hour in thoughtful conversation regarding forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of healing following profound trauma. "You solved the crime," the vicar had said as he prepared to leave. "I observed patterns in human behavior," Miss Marple replied gently, "and I understood that crimes are rarely committed by the people we expect them to be committed by. The truth emerges not from dramatic revelation but from careful attention to the small inconsistencies that reveal the presence of deception." As the summer light faded toward evening, Miss Marple reflected upon the terrible fragility of human relationships, the way that years of deception and silence could accumulate until even the gentlest pressure became sufficient to shatter carefully constructed lives. Little Ashford had learned a bitter lesson about the cost of keeping secrets, about the violence that could emerge when desperation overwhelmed reason. Yet the village endured, as villages had endured for centuries, incorporating tragedy into its collective memory and gradually moving forward. The trial of Eleanor Ashford took place in the autumn, a proceeding that drew considerable attention from the regional newspapers and curious observers from surrounding villages. The courtroom became a stage upon which the private agonies of the Ashford family were displayed for public consumption, each revelation more damaging than the last. The prosecution presented their case with methodical efficiency, establishing motive, opportunity, and the undeniable fact that Eleanor Ashford had struck Lady Thornfield multiple times with the fireplace poker. The physical evidence, while minimal, supported this narrative. The testimony of Diana Ashford, though emotionally devastating to deliver, provided clear corroboration of her mother's actions. The defense, however, presented a portrait of a woman whose mental faculties had been severely compromised by years of psychological stress and emotional trauma. Expert witnesses testified regarding her deteriorating mental state, her increasing reliance upon sedative medications, her manifestation of symptoms consistent with profound anxiety and depression. They argued that Eleanor Ashford, at the moment of the crime, had been incapable of forming the rational intent necessary for a conviction on charges of murder. Instead, they suggested that she had acted in a state of diminished responsibility, her actions the product of a mind fractured by desperation rather than calculated intention. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The judge, a man of considerable experience with cases involving mental health and criminal responsibility, appeared deeply troubled throughout the proceedings. The jury, composed of 12 ordinary citizens drawn from the surrounding communities, deliberated for 5 days before returning with a verdict that reflected the genuine moral complexity of the case. Eleanor Ashford was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, a verdict that acknowledged her culpability while recognizing the extraordinary circumstances of her mental state. She was sentenced to 8 years' imprisonment, a punishment that seemed to neither satisfy nor entirely convince those who followed the case. Miss Marple attended one session of the trial, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, observing the proceedings with her characteristic composure. She had not been called to testify, as her role in the investigation had been peripheral and based largely upon speculation rather than concrete evidence. Yet her presence seemed to affect Eleanor Ashford considerably. When their eyes met briefly across the courtroom, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, precisely, but recognition of human frailty and the terrible consequences that could emerge from years of accumulated deception. Following the verdict, Miss Marple Mystery read a letter from Eleanor Ashford, written from the prison where she awaited transfer to serve her sentence. The letter, composed in careful handwriting, expressed neither self-pity nor defensive justification. Instead, it acknowledged the harm she had caused, the lives she had damaged through her actions, and her attempt to understand the psychological processes that had led her to commit violence. "I do not expect forgiveness," Eleanor wrote, "either from God or from the people of Little Ashford. What I have come to understand through the long hours in my cell is that my attempt to preserve my family's reputation through deception ultimately destroyed it far more thoroughly than honesty ever could have. I protected lies at the cost of human dignity, including my own. I cannot undo what I have done, but I can acknowledge its terrible consequences and attempt to ensure that my remaining years are devoted to understanding the person I became and preventing others from traveling the same destructive path." Dr. Ashford, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated within the village. Patients ceased attending his practice. Social invitations dried to nothing. The man who had built his reputation upon the facade of respectability discovered that respectability, once lost, could not easily be recovered. He eventually sold his practice to a younger physician and relocated to a distant city where his notoriety might not precede him. Diana Ashford made the unexpected decision to remain in Little Ashford, taking employment as a teacher at the village school. She established herself as a quiet, competent woman whose past tragedy was known but not discussed. Gradually, the village's judgment softened from active condemnation to something approaching acceptance, though an undercurrent of wariness always remained. Geoffrey Marsh recovered his health slowly, finding employment as head gardener at a neighboring estate. He never married, never established a family of his own, though he maintained a respectful correspondence with Marcus Thornfield regarding the estate he might have inherited under different circumstances. The two men, connected through the tragedy that had consumed their lives, developed an unlikely friendship based upon shared understanding of loss and disappointment. The morning room at Thornfield House underwent extensive renovation following the trial. The fireplace was moved, the carpet replaced, the walls repainted in new colors. Marcus Thornfield seemed determined to expunge every physical reminder of the violence that had occurred within those walls, though such erasure could never be complete. Miss Marple observed all of these developments from her position at the periphery of village life. She attended the village church services, participated in the post office gossip, tended her garden, and continued her endless knitting. To casual observation, she was simply an elderly woman living out her quiet retirement in a peaceful English village. Yet those who knew her understood that her observations continued, her understanding of human nature deepened, her repository of examples accumulated. One afternoon in late October, as autumn transformed the village into shades of gold and crimson, Miss Marple sat beneath the cedar tree where she had sat on the day of Lady Thornfield's garden party. The seasons had completed their cycle. The wound that the village had suffered was beginning to scar over, the raw pain transforming gradually into something that could be integrated into the collective memory. She thought of Eleanor Ashford, imprisoned now, but perhaps finding in that confinement a strange kind of peace. She thought of the terrible price that had been paid for years of maintained deceptions, for the belief that reputat, ion, could be preserved through silence rather than truth. The village, she reflected, had learned its lesson, though the learning had come at tremendous cost. The autumn progressed toward winter, with the relentless advance of seasons that cared nothing for human tragedy. The village adjusted to its new reality with the quiet resilience that small communities possessed, the capacity to absorb shock, to grieve privately, and to continue functioning with the understanding that life did not pause for individual suffering. Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor on a grey November afternoon. The woman who appeared at her cottage door was unfamiliar, yet there was something in her features that suggested a connection to the events that had unfolded in the preceding months. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to assess Miss Marple with considerable interest. "I am Margaret Hayes," the woman introduced herself. "I believe you may know who I am, or rather, who I was." Miss Marple's composure remained undisturbed, though her mind raced with the implications of this unexpected visit. "You are the child who was given up for adoption," she said quietly, inviting the woman inside. "I am," Margaret confirmed, settling herself in the familiar wingback chair. "I learned of my existence only recently, through the intervention of Marcus Thornfield. He discovered, through his grandmother's private papers, the full story of my birth and adoption. He felt that I had the right to know the truth about my family." "And what do you intend to do with that knowledge?" Miss Marple asked gently. Margaret's expression was complex, a mixture of grief, anger, confusion, and something that might have been tentative hope. "I do not know precisely. I have spent my entire life believing myself to be an orphan, raised by a kind but distant adoptive family. To suddenly discover that I have a biological mother, a father, a sibling, it is overwhelming. Yet I have also learned that my biological family has been destroyed by the secrets surrounding my existence." "Secrets," Miss Marple reflected, "rarely remain hidden indefinitely. And the longer they are maintained, the greater the violence required to protect them." "I have visited my mother in prison," Margaret continued. "Eleanor Ashford, the woman who gave birth to me and then agreed to let me be taken away. We spoke for only 20 minutes, supervised and awkward, yet in that brief time I felt something shift within me. She is suffering, profoundly and genuinely suffering, for what she has done. But she is also suffering for the choices she made decades ago. Choices she was forced to make by a society that demanded respectability above honesty." Miss Marple listened with the attentive silence of someone whose understanding ran deep enough to require no elaboration. "I have also met Diana," Margaret said. "My half-sister, though we had never known of our connection until recently. We spent an afternoon together, and it was remarkable how much we resembled each other in ways that had nothing to do with physical appearance. We both seemed to carry the weight of family secrets, the burden of unspoken truths." "Will you establish a relationship with your biological family?" Miss Marple asked. "I do not know," Margaret admitted. "My adoptive family, while not entirely warm, provided stability and security. My biological family, it seems, provided little but suffering and deception. Yet they are still my family. The question of whether I forgive them, whether I can love them despite the choices they have made, these are questions I am only beginning to ask myself." Over the following weeks, Margaret Hayes became an occasional presence in Little Ashford. She visited Diana Ashford regularly, and the two women formed a tentative bond based upon their shared history and shared pain. She wrote letters to her mother in prison, a correspondence. That seemed to provide Eleanor with something approaching purpose during her incarceration. She even established a respectful, distant relationship with her father, who had begun a new life in the city under the assumption that his past could be escaped. It could not be escaped, of course. Dr. Ashford discovered that his infidelities and deceits had followed him into his new community. That reputation, once damaged, cast a long shadow. He lived a quieter life than before, his medical practice reduced, his social circle limited to the few who did not know his history or did not care sufficiently to condemn him for it. Miss Marple observed these developments with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen human nature reveal itself in its full complexity. She had never believed in simple villains or simple heroes. People were always more complicated than such categorizations allowed, driven by fears and desires that often contradicted their conscious intentions, capable of great harm while simultaneously capable of redemption. One afternoon, Margaret Hayes called upon Miss Marple for a final time before returning to her life in London. They sat together in Miss Marple's sitting room, and Margaret expressed her gratitude for the role Miss Marple had played in uncovering the truth. "You could have remained silent," Margaret said. You could have allowed my existence to remain a secret. Instead, you ensured that the truth emerged, and that truth, while painful, has also liberated me from the uncertainty I did not even know I carried. The truth, Miss Marple replied, is rarely comfortable. But falsehood is far more destructive in the long term. What you are experiencing now, this confusion, this pain, this tentative possibility of connection, is far preferable to a lifetime of not knowing who you truly are. As Margaret prepared to depart, Miss Marple reflected upon a journey that had begun with a woman's cry and a body upon a Turkish carpet. The investigation had concluded. Justice, imperfect and complicated as justice always was, had been administered. Yet the true resolution lay not in courts or verdicts, but in the gradual, painful process of human beings learning to face the truth of their lives and attempting, however imperfectly, to build something honest upon that foundation. The winter of that year was particularly severe, with snow blanketing Little Ashford for weeks at a time, isolating the village from the broader world and creating a peculiar atmosphere of introspection and stillness. Miss Marple found herself spending more time indoors, her knitting accumulating into garments she donated to the church for distribution to those in need. The village, having survived scandal and tragedy, settled into a quieter rhythm that seemed almost meditative in its restraint. It was during this period that Inspector Graves returned to Little Ashford on what appeared to be a social visit. He called upon Miss Marple on a cold afternoon in January, bringing with him a box of her favorite tea and an expression that suggested he carried something more significant than mere pleasantries. "I wanted you to know," he said, accepting her offer of tea, "that the case has been officially closed. All loose ends have been tied, all statements filed, all evidence catalogued. Eleanor Ashford's appeal has been denied, and she will serve her sentence as determined by the court." "I see," Miss Marple replied. "And are you satisfied with the outcome?" Inspector Graves hesitated, a pause that suggested the question had touched upon something that continued to trouble him. "I am satisfied with the legal resolution," he said carefully. "Yet I confess that I remain uncertain whether justice has truly been served. Eleanor Ashford committed an act of violence, CE, that resulted in death. She has been punished for that act. Yet the circumstances that created her desperation, the infidelities, the deceptions, the systematic erosion of her mental and emotional stability, those circumstances involved others who faced no legal consequences. The law, Miss Marple observed, operates within particular parameters. It concerns itself with specific acts rather than with the complex chain of circumstances that led to those acts. In some ways, this limitation serves justice. In other ways, it prevents a fuller accounting of responsibility." "Precisely," Graves agreed. "Dr. Ashford's infidelity was not a crime. His deception, while morally reprehensible, was not a matter for legal prosecution. Yet his actions created the conditions within which his wife's mental state deteriorated to the point of violence. Is he truly blameless?" "He is legally blameless," Miss Marple said. "But legal innocence and moral innocence are not always the same thing. Dr. Ashford will spend the remainder of his life understanding, at some level, the consequences of his choices. That understanding may be a form of punishment more severe than any legal system could impose." The inspector departed eventually, leaving Miss Marple with the sense that he had needed to discuss his doubts regarding the case's resolution with someone who would understand the moral complexity involved. She had provided him with neither reassurance nor condemnation, merely the acknowledgement that justice, in its various forms, was far more intricate than the legal system typically recognized. As winter progressed towards spring, Little Ashford began its slow transformation. Snow melted into streams that flowed through the village toward the larger rivers beyond. Gardens, dormant and grey, began to show the first tentative signs of renewal. The village itself seemed to shed the weight of previous year's tragedy with the seasonal change, though the marks remained visible to those who knew where to look. Geoffrey Marsh, working at his new position as head gardener, sent word through mutual acquaintances that he had recovered his equilibrium. He had established a small garden of his own, growing vegetables and flowers with the precision and care that characterized everything he undertook. The physical scars on his wrists faded gradually, though the emotional scars would remain visible to himself alone for many years to come. Diana Ashford flourished in her position as a teacher, bringing to her work a compassion born of understanding suffering. Her students responded to her with the instinctive recognition that this was a woman who had endured pain and emerged with her kindness intact. She never spoke of her family's tragedy, yet her silence regarding it seemed to communicate something profound about acceptance and the possibility of moving beyond shame. Dr. Ashford, in the distant city where he had established his new life, gradually rebuilt a medical practice. It would never achieve the prominence of his previous position, yet it sustained him with a sufficiency that allowed him to exist if not flourish. He began, tentatively, to correspond with his daughter Diana, their letters carefully formal but suggesting the possibility that some form of relationship might eventually be reconstructed. Eleanor Ashford, imprisoned now for nearly a year, had begun work in the prison's education program, teaching other inmates to read and write. The work provided her with purpose and with the understanding that redemption, while perhaps never complete, could at least be attempted. Her correspondence with both her biological daughter Margaret and her biological son Geoffrey continued, the letters carrying a tone of genuine penitence mixed with recognition of the complexity that had led to her actions. Marcus Thornfield, having inherited his grandmother's estate and fortune, devoted himself to philanthropic work. He established scholarships for young people from modest circumstances, founded a small hospital wing dedicated to mental health treatment, and worked quietly to repair some of the damage that his family's deceptions had caused. He never spoke publicly of his grandmother's death or the circumstances surrounding it, yet his actions suggested a man attempting to transform family tragedy into something of broader social benefit. Miss Marple, observing all of these developments from her position at the village's heart, continued her quiet life. Her knitting needles clicked their familiar rhythm. Her garden produced its flowers and vegetables with reliable consistency. She attended church services and participated in village functions with the composure of someone entirely comfortable with both her knowledge and her limitations. Yet there was something different now in the way the village regarded her. People who had previously dismissed her as simply a pleasant elderly woman had come to recognize her as possessing a particular kind of wisdom, the wisdom of someone who understood that human nature, in all its terrible complexity, could not be reduced to simple categories of good and evil, guilt and innocence, victim and perpetrator. She had not solved the mystery through detective work in the traditional sense. She had solved it through patient observation of human behavior and through the understanding that people, when confronted with their own desperation, inevitably revealed their truths. Spring arrived in Little Ashford with the insistence of renewal that could not be denied. The gardens burst into bloom with extraordinary vigor, as though the earth itself sought to compensate for the darkness of the previous year. Miss Marple stood in her own garden on a warm afternoon in May, surveying the roses and lavender with the satisfaction of someone who had learned long ago that some things, at least, followed predictable and orderly patterns. She was trimming dead blooms from a particularly robust rosebush when Reverend Blackwell arrived, his expression suggesting he carried news of some significance. The vicar had aged noticeably over the past year, the weight of his parishioners' spiritual crises having etched themselves into his features. Yet his eyes retained their fundamental kindness, and his smile, when it came, remained warm. "I have received a letter from Eleanor Ashford," he said, settling himself on the garden bench. "She has asked me to convey a message to you. She will not be writing directly, as she feels that any personal communication might intrude upon your privacy. Yet she wanted you to know that she has come to understand the gift you gave her." "A gift?" Miss Marple paused in her pruning, regarding the vicar with interest. "The gift of truth," Reverend Blackwell explained. "She tells me that in the months following her conviction, she contemplated suicide more than once. The weight of what she had done, the destruction she had caused, seemed unbearable. Yet she came to understand that her continued living, her attempt to understand herself and to atone for her actions, was perhaps the only meaningful response she could make to the tragedy she had created. You forced that understanding upon her by refusing to permit the deception to continue. Miss Marple returned her attention to the roses, her pruning shears moving with practiced precision. I did not force anything upon Mrs. Ashford. I merely ensured that the truth emerged. What she has done with that truth is entirely her own achievement. She also wanted you to know, the vicar continued, that Diana has visited her regularly, and that they have begun the long process of rebuilding their relationship. It is painful and complicated, but it is honest. Eleanor feels that this honesty is worth the pain. After the vicar departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden as the afternoon light transformed the world into shades of gold and amber. She thought about the year that had passed, about the cascade of revelations that had begun with a woman's scream and a body upon a Turkish carpet. She thought about how that single act of violence had unraveled decades of carefully maintained deceptions, exposing the fragility of the facade that the village had constructed around itself. The truth, she had learned again through this case, was not a simple thing to be discovered and then forgotten. Truth was a living entity that continued to shape lives long after its revelation. Eleanor Ashford would serve her sentence, would attempt her redemption, would live with the consequences of her actions for the remainder of her existence, but she would do so with the understanding that she had been seen, that her suffering was acknowledged, that her attempt to rebuild some form of honesty from the wreckage of her life was recognized as meaningful. The village itself had been transformed by what it had learned about itself. The carefully maintained surfaces of respectability had been stripped away, revealing the complex and often painful realities beneath. Some residents had left entirely, unable to bear the association with scandal. Others had remained, but with a different understanding of their community's nature. Still others, like Diana Ashford, had deepened their commitment to the village and to the possibility of building something genuine from the ruins of what had been destroyed. As the evening light began to fade, Miss Marple reflected upon her own role in these events. She had not solved the mystery through superior intellect or through careful forensic analysis. She had solved it through patience, through attention, through the willingness to observe human behavior without judgment while simultaneously maintaining clear moral perception. She had understood that Eleanor Ashford, despite the terrible violence of her actions, was not simply a villain but a woman broken by circumstances and by the impossible demands of maintaining a false life. This understanding did not excuse Eleanor's violence, yet it contextualized it, placed it within a framework that acknowledged the complexity of human motivation and the way that desperation could overwhelm even the strongest moral convictions. The case had come to its legal conclusion, but Miss Marple understood that the true resolution would extend far beyond courtrooms and verdicts. It would unfold over years as people gradually integrated the truth of what had occurred into their understanding of themselves and their community. It would appear in the letters that Eleanor Ashford wrote from prison, in the teaching she undertook, in the slow rebuilding of relationships between family members fractured by deception. It would manifest in Diana Ashford's gentle compassion toward her students, in Geoffrey Marsh's careful cultivation of his garden, in Margaret Hayes' tentative attempts to connect with the family that had given her life but not raised her. As darkness fell, and Miss Marple rose to return to her cottage, she carried with her the satisfaction that came from having witnessed human nature in its full complexity and responded with neither condemnation nor false forgiveness, but with the clear-eyed recognition of what people were capable of becoming when forced to confront the truth of their circumstances. Little Ashford would recover from this tragedy. Villages, like people, possessed remarkable resilience. Yet they would never be precisely what they had been before, nor should they be. The knowledge of human fragility once gained could not be unknown. The awareness of how easily deception could accumulate, how silently desperation could build, how suddenly violence could emerge from the most unexpected quarters, these understandings had become part of the village's collective consciousness. Miss Marple set her pruning shears aside and walked through her garden toward her cottage. Behind her, the roses continued their bloom, indifferent to human tragedy, beautiful and temporary, and true to their nature. It was perhaps, she thought, a fitting metaphor for the human experience itself, the capacity for both beauty and destruction, the necessity of growth and decay, the ongoing cycle of renewal that continued regardless of individual suffering. The mystery of Lady Thornfield's death had been solved. But the deeper mystery, the mystery of human nature itself, with all its contradictions and capacities, would remain unsolved, as perhaps it was meant to be.